A child drew the same grave twice. A Miss Marple mystery. The drawing was of a grave. Miss Marple heard about it on a Wednesday from Henrietta Brockley, over tea that had gone slightly cold while Henrietta talked. The radiator in the sitting room at Larkspur House made a sound like distant machinery, and outside the window the October garden was losing its argument with the wind. Miss Marple had a chest cold that had now lasted 11 days and showed no interest in departing, and she had run out of knitting wool on Monday. She was, in short, bored, which was why she was listening rather carefully. Miss Arkwright pinned it on the classroom wall, Henrietta said. She was a tall woman, Henrietta, with the restless energy of someone who should have been a magistrate, and instead spent her energy on village committees. She thought it was interesting. You know how teachers are. They encourage the dark ones. But then she looked at it more closely and thought, "Oh dear." "Tell me about the drawing," said Miss Marple. Well, it was a grave. A fresh one. The child had drawn the earth mounded up, the way it looks just after. And a yew tree, which is accurate because there is one, on the north side of St. Cuthbert's, and a man standing beside it wearing a green coat. Henrietta paused to refill their cups. Rather good, actually, for a 7-year-old. Posey has always been a particular child. Particular, Miss Marple repeated. The word interested her. Precise. Her mother is the same, Eleanor Hadlow. She runs the post office now since her father died. You wouldn't have met her. She keeps to herself since the war took her husband. Henrietta sat back down. Anyway, everyone said how charming, how imaginative, what a talented child. And then 3 weeks later, the man in the green coat, said Miss Marple. Henrietta looked at her. Yes, how did you— It seemed the logical continuation. It was, as these things go in villages, a story that had arrived in layers. The body was found on a Saturday morning by Tom Pruitt, who kept the churchyard tidy on a volunteer basis and had strong opinions about the area beneath the North Yew, which had a tendency to subside. He noticed the ground had been turned over. He investigated. He fetched the vicar. The vicar fetched Dr. Haydock, and Haydock fetched the police, and by Sunday afternoon the whole of Wexley Combe had fetched the story in one form or another. The dead man had no immediate identification on him beyond a notebook, a return train ticket from Exeter, and a photograph. He wore a bottle green wool overcoat, second-hand by the look of it, slightly too large across the shoulders. "The photograph," Miss Marple said. "You mentioned a photograph." "I'm getting to that." Henrietta didn't like being hurried. The thing is, nobody knew him. He wasn't local. Inspector Crewe came down from Taunton. What about Posey's drawing? Exactly. Well, Miss Arkwright remembered it, naturally. It had been on the wall 3 weeks. She told Inspector Crewe, and he came to look at it and stood there for a long time and then asked if he could take it down. Posey's mother said yes, and then— Henrietta put down her cup. Then Posey drew it again. The fire settled. Rain began against the window. Miss Marple pulled her shawl around her shoulders and waited. The same picture," said Henrietta. "Same grave, same yew tree, same man in the green coat. Except this time there was a second figure. A woman in the background. And the woman was holding something. A key, Posey said when they asked her." "Did Posey say where the drawing came from? What gave her the idea?" "She said it was from the tin." Henrietta frowned. Nobody quite understood what she meant. She's a dreamy child, apparently, on top of being precise. Her mother said she'd been having bad dreams. Miss Marple looked at the rain on the glass. "How old is Posey?" 7. 7.5, she would insist on telling you. Her birthday's in March. 7.5, Miss Marple thought. Old enough to copy something carefully. Young enough not to know what it meant. She thought of the north side of St. Cuthbert's, which she had now not yet been well enough to visit. The yew tree there was old. She had seen it from the road on the drive into Wexley Combe. A large tree, the kind that had stood long enough to watch several generations come and go without remarking on any of them. And Eleanor Hadlow, she said, she's managing all right, with the child and the post office and as well as anyone could, Henrietta said, which in her vocabulary meant not well, but carrying on, which was the expected standard.
The child who drew a grave. I have a peculiar feeling, Inspector, this isn't just a child's imagination.
A very good day to you. In our quiet village, little Posey drew a picture of a grave before anyone even knew it was there. A stranger in a green coat was found under the old yew tree. We later learn he had been... A child found an old tin box hidden among dusty boxes. We all have boxes like that, don't we? I had to listen to dear Henrietta talk until my tea went cold. But you know, patience is... Eleanor Hadlow lost her husband in the war and now manages all alone. We understand that kind of quiet grief. They tried to tell little Posey to say her drawing was just imagination. But true observation is much more powerful.
The ancient yew tree in our churchyard has watched generations come and go. Nature is the ultimate silent witness.
In a village, stories arrive in layers, like peeling an onion. Life is rarely simple. Everything is... Dr. Haydock is a sensible man, and sensible people know that sometimes the truth is deeply unpleasant.
What the doctor said Dr. Haydock came to Larkspur House on Thursday. For what was technically a medical visit, Miss Marple's chest cold, and became in practice a conversation of a different kind. He was a sensible man, Haydock. He had been sensible for 30 years, which had made him very good at his work, and occasionally impatient with nonsense. He did not consider Miss Marple nonsense. He had learned this lesson some time ago. He listened to her chest, pronounced it improved, and accepted tea. He had the look of a man who had not been sleeping especially well. "The stranger," said Miss Marple when they had settled. "The man in the green coat. Have they identified him?" Haydock glanced at her. "How did you—" "Henrietta told me about the drawing. I was curious about the rest." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. "Leonard Goss, 41 years old, clerk from Exeter. That's what the notebook turned up, eventually. His name was written inside the front cover, the old-fashioned way. The police traced him through his lodgings." He paused. The notebook itself was full. Names, dates, addresses going back 20 years, all in a very small hand. What kind of names? People he'd written to, as far as they can tell. Agencies, government offices, Somerset records, the sort of correspondence a man conducts when he's looking for something and not finding it. Haydock set down his cup. "They think he'd been trying to trace someone. Inquiries going back to 1943. Miss Marple's needles, which she had borrowed from Henrietta to give her hands something to do, clicked once and stopped. "He had no family listed," Haydock continued. "None that the Exeter police could find quickly. He lived alone. Paid his rent on time, apparently. The landlady described him as quiet. Said he went away on trips sometimes, looking into things. She didn't know what things." "The photograph," said Miss Marple. Haydock looked at her steadily. "Oh, Henrietta told you. She mentioned it. She didn't know what was in it. No." He was quiet again, The way he got when something was sitting awkwardly with him. It was in his breast pocket, inside an envelope, a photograph of a girl, 14, perhaps 15, standing in front of a farmhouse gate, wearing a summer dress. She was laughing at whoever held the camera. He paused. On the back, written in old ink, not his handwriting, older than that, the name E. Hadlow and a date, 1938. The rain had stopped at some point. The garden outside dripped steadily onto the flagstones. "Eleanor Hadlow," said Miss Marple. "As a girl, yes, 14 years old, which would be right. She's 34 now." He picked up his cup, found it empty, set it down again. The police showed it to her. She said she'd never seen it before. It didn't know how it came to be in the dead man's pocket. That's her statement. Was she telling the truth? Crewe thinks so. I'm not certain. Haydock rubbed the back of his neck. She went very white when she saw it. Not frightened exactly. More like someone who's been waiting for a knock at the door and has finally heard it. Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking at the rain-damp garden, where Henrietta's late roses were still clinging on, 3 weeks past their time. "Her father," she said, "the one who died. What did he do?" "Gerald Hadlow. Ran the farm until he sold most of the land in 48. Before that, during the war, I mean, he was the billeting officer for the parish, responsible for placing the evacuees. There were many, a dozen or so, over the course of the war. Most went back to London when things settled. One didn't." Miss Marple looked at him then. "A boy," Haydock said. "Robert something, I believe. 8 or 9 years old, from Bermondsey. He'd been billeted at the Hadlow farmhouse from the autumn of 42. In the summer of 43, he disappeared. The official conclusion was that he'd run away, homesick, difficult child, the usual thing. Gerald Hadlow filed the report. The authorities accepted it." He paused. "Nobody looked very hard." "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't suppose they did." She was thinking about the name in Leonard Goss's notebook. Names and dates going back to 1943. A quiet man who went on trips looking into things. A return ticket from Exeter to Wexley Combe, which was not on any main line, and required 2 changes and a deliberate decision to come here. "The boy's name," she said. "Robert. Do you know his surname?" "I'd have to look it up." "Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple carefully, "Leonard Goss was 41 years old. If the missing boy was 8 or 9 in 1943, he would be, well, he would be much the same age as Leonard Goss, had he lived." Haydock was still for a moment. Brothers? Perhaps. It would explain a great deal. She picked up the borrowed knitting needles again. A man spends 30 years looking for his brother. He finally traces him to the last known address. He comes to Wexley Combe. She paused. He finds something or someone who knows what happened. And then he is found under the same yew tree. "You think the boy is buried there too?" "I think it would be worth asking." Haydock looked at her. This was not, his expression suggested, what he had come to Wexley Combe expecting to deal with, and then again, it never was.
The man in the green coat. I think I've found our motive.
Good day to you again. My dear friend Dr. Haydock came to check on my chest cold, but our tea turned to darker matters. Let me tell you who he was. His name was Leonard Goss. Just a quiet clerk from Exeter. It is a sobering. The police found his notebook. 30 years of careful notes, tracing lost names and dead ends. He carried an old photograph of a young girl laughing at a farm gate. It was Eleanor Hadlow, taken before the war. When the police showed Eleanor the photo, Dr. Haydock said she didn't look merely surprised. She looked like someone waiting for a terrible knock at the door. Dr. Haydock asked if I thought the little boy was buried under the same tree as his brother. The earth is a faithful... A rusted tin box was discovered in a dusty back room, opened very recently.
There's something else, he said. The police found a tin box in Eleanor Hadlow's back room, among things that had come from her father's old office at the farmhouse when it was sold. Eleanor said she hadn't opened most of the boxes. The farmhouse had been sold in 1949, and she'd just put her father's things in the spare room and left them there. He stopped, and the tin box had been opened. Recently, the lid was clean of dust on the inside, while the outside was thick with it. And inside there was a child's diary. Old paper, pencil, 1943, and some drawings. He met her eyes. Similar drawings, Miss Marple. A yew tree, a mound of earth, a figure watching. Who had opened the tin? Eleanor said she hadn't. She said the only person who'd been in that room recently was Posey. He paused. On a rainy afternoon in September, apparently, when her mother was busy at the post office counter. Miss Marple was quiet for quite a long time. The last of Henrietta's borrowed wool wound around the needle, and she came to the end of a row. "How old did you say Posey was?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well. "7, said Miss Marple. "Yes." She looked out at the garden, where the light was going out of the afternoon earlier now, the way it did in October. A 7-year-old girl, alone in a dusty room on a rainy afternoon, opening a tin box that didn't belong to her, finding drawings inside. A yew tree, a grave, a figure watching, copying what she saw, not understanding, just copying, with the careful faithfulness of a child who has been told that drawing means looking properly at a thing. I should like to meet Eleanor Hadlow," Miss Marple said, "when I'm a little better. And I should like very much to see the diary."
The crest, it's the one I was looking for. Now, what's inside?
A very good day to you. We learned that the police found an old biscuit tin in Eleanor's dusty back room. It makes one think, doesn't it? Eleanor claimed she hadn't touched her father's things since 1949. We understand that impulse, don't we? The police noticed the tin was thick with dust, yet the inside lid was wiped clean. Oh, the details always tell the true story. Inside that tin was a crumbling diary from 1943. A diary is a powerful thing. Eleanor realised that only her 7-year-old daughter, Posey, had been in that dusty room. Children have an insatiable curiosity. Posey simply copied the drawings she found, not understanding the horror they represented. It is the great blessing of childhood. When Dr. Haydock told me this, I sat quietly for a very long time. In our youth, I told the doctor I wished to meet Eleanor and her little girl. We may be old in years, my friends, but our minds are sharp.
Eleanor Hadlow was not what Miss Marple had expected, which was itself instructive. She had formed a picture from Henrietta's description. A war widow running a post office, keeping to herself, managing. The picture was of someone worn down, apologetic about her circumstances. The woman who came to Larkspur House on Friday afternoon, at Miss Marple's invitation relayed through Henrietta, was not that at all. She was dark-haired, 34, with her father's watchful look and a way of standing in a doorway as though she was deciding whether the room was worth entering. She wore a good wool skirt that was slightly too formal for a Friday afternoon in somebody's sitting room, or as if she had been on her way somewhere else for a long time and kept not arriving. She had brought Posey. Posey was small and fair, and wholly unlike her mother. She sat in the chair Henrietta indicated and looked at Miss Marple with the direct, assessing stare of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude, or has learned it and decided not to apply it in this instance. "Posey," said Miss Marple. "What a nice name." "It's short for Josephine," Posey said. "I prefer Posey. Josephine sounds like someone's aunt." "Posey," Eleanor said quietly. "It does, though." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. "I expect it does," she agreed. "Do you like drawing, Posey?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I like drawing better than sums. Miss Arkwright says I'm good at it. Miss Arkwright told me so too." Posey looked interested at this. "Did she say about my picture?" "She did. The one with the grave." It wasn't a question. Posey drew her feet up onto the chair rung and balanced there, a habit her mother had evidently given up discouraging. "Everyone keeps asking about that picture. Mummy says I should say I made it up." Eleanor's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. "Posey, she didn't say lie," Posey said, fair-minded about this. "She said I should say it was from my imagination, but it wasn't. It was from the tin." "Will you tell me about the tin?" said Miss Marple. It came out in the way that children tell things, not in order, with digressions, circling back. Posey had been in the spare room because it was raining, and she wasn't allowed to be in the garden when it rained. And the spare room had boxes in it, and she had been looking at the boxes. Most of them were taped shut. The tin wasn't. "It was under one of the boxes," Posey said. "A flat tin, like for biscuits. But it had a picture of flowers on the lid, red ones. I opened it because I thought there might be biscuits, but there weren't." "What was in it?" "Papers. And a little book with a cover like leather, but it was very old. And the leather was cracking off at the corners. And drawings," she considered. "Not very good drawings. The yew tree looked like a lollipop. But I could tell what it was because there's only one yew tree in the churchyard, and I've seen it. And there was the grave picture. With the man. Was there a man in the original drawing? In the tin?" Posey thought carefully. "There was a shape beside the tree. I made it more like a man in mine because a shape looked wrong." "Ah," said Miss Marple. Eleanor had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone hearing a conversation conducted in a language they mostly speak. "She didn't understand any of it," she said to Miss Marple, rather than to Posey. "She was just copying pictures, like she copies things from books." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Of course. Children are very faithful copyists." She reached for her tea. The movement was unhurried, entirely ordinary, the reach of an elderly woman who wanted her cup. But her eyes, for just a moment, went to Posey's face, the child's absorbed, precise expression, the slight frown of someone who has understood more than the adults in the room are crediting. "Posey," said Miss Marple, "in your second drawing, the one you did after the man in the green coat was found, you added a woman in the background." "She was in the little book," Posey said. "I missed her the first time. She was drawn very small, at the edge of one of the pages, just a figure. She had something in her hand. I thought it was a key because of the shape." "Was there anything else about her? Anything you noticed?" Posey's brow furrowed. She was taking the question seriously, which was the right way to take it. "She had something on her dress, or her coat, at the top." She touched her own collarbone, left side. "A little shape. I drew it as a dot because it was too small to draw properly. In the book, I mean. I made it a bit bigger in my picture, but it still just looked like a dot." Eleanor was watching her daughter now. "A brooch? Perhaps," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Maybe." Posey dropped her feet from the chair rung and stood up with the sudden purposefulness of a child who has finished with a topic. "Can I look at the garden?" "Of course," said Henrietta from the doorway. "Come and see whether the last rose is still on. I've been watching it." They went out. The sitting room was quiet. Eleanor looked at Miss Marple without speaking. "The diary?" Miss Marple said. "You've read it?" "Some of it." She was careful with the word some. "The writing is old-fashioned, and the pencil is faint in places." "But you understood what it was." It wasn't a question. Eleanor seemed to recognize it as such. "It was written by a girl, in service at our house during the war." "A housemaid?" She stopped. I didn't know her. I was 15 in 1943. I was away at school." "Do you know her name?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. The diary was signed with initials only, a C, but my father's records from that time, I found them in one of the other boxes, years ago, the household ledger. A girl called Agnes Croft was employed from September 1942. She paused. "She left in the autumn of 1943, a few months after Robert Goss disappeared." The name landed in the room between them. "You know his name," said Miss Marple. "Inspector Crewe told me." Eleanor's voice was careful, even, the voice of someone who has been careful for a long time and is finding it increasingly difficult. "He told me about the notebook, about Leonard Goss, about—" She stopped, pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. "He was looking for his brother for 30 years. He came here and somebody killed him." "Yes." "My father's photograph was in his pocket." "Yes." Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were dry. This, Miss Marple thought, was a woman who had been crying in private and had decided to stop, at least for now. "Inspector Crewe thinks I took the photograph from the body before I reported it. He hasn't said so plainly, but I can see it in how he talks to me." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Did you?" The silence stretched. Outside, Posey's voice floated through the window, something about the rose. "Yes," Eleanor said, "because you recognized the photograph." "It was from my father's study. A frame on his desk. A photograph of me at the gate of the farm, the summer before the war. The frame was there until he died. Then I packed up his things." She looked down. "I don't know how Leonard Goss got it, and whether my father gave it to him, or whether he found it somehow, or—" She stopped again. "I panicked. I saw it and I panicked and I put it in my coat pocket before anyone else was close enough to see. That was stupid. I know that was stupid." "It was frightened," said Miss Marple with some precision, "which is different." Eleanor looked at her. Something in her face shifted slightly, not relief, but the thing just before relief, when a person understands they are not going to be accused of something they didn't do. "The diary," Miss Marple said. "May I see it?" Eleanor opened her bag. She had brought it with her, wrapped in a piece of cloth, which meant she had intended to show it to Miss Marple from the moment she accepted the invitation. She set it on the table between them. It was small. A child's diary, or meant for one. The leather cover had once been brown, was now closer to grey, the corners separating from the board beneath. Miss Marple put on her reading glasses and opened it. The handwriting was small, pressed hard into the paper with the particular force of someone writing in secret quickly. The date at the top of the first entry was October 1942. She turned pages. November. December. The entries were irregular, sometimes a week apart, sometimes a day. A girl writing about cold mornings, about the farm, about the evacuees she helped look after, about a boy named Robert who was difficult and homesick and knocked over his milk on purpose 3 times in 1 week. The entries in the spring and summer of 1943 were longer. The handwriting changed, still small, still careful, but the pressure was different. Harder, as though the pen was being held too tightly. Miss Marple read 2 entries in full. Then she closed the diary and set it down. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. "You've read enough," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question either. Yes. Miss Marple looked at the covered garden outside. Posey's voice again, pleased about something. The rose was still on, apparently. "The girl who kept this diary, Agnes Croft. Do you know what became of her?" "She married. I don't know who." Eleanor hesitated. Henrietta might know. The Brooch Miss Marple asked Henrietta that evening, over a supper neither of them ate very much of. Henrietta thought for a while. Then she said Agnes Phelps. She married the brother of Reverend Phelps, Arthur Phelps, who ran the garage until it closed. Arthur died, 10 years ago. Agnes has lived with her brother at the vicarage ever since. "I see," said Miss Marple.
I believe the gardener knows more than he's letting on.
The gardener?
Yes. His tools are too clean for a man with a guilty conscience. Good day to you. When Eleanor arrived, she was not the weeping, broken widow we expected. Little Posey had a stare that pierced right through you. And Posey was about to be very honest indeed. Eleanor tried to make the child say the drawing was just imagination. The child described the diary. Old, crumbling, flaking away at the edges. Posey remembered a tiny detail she left out of her first drawing. A small mark on the woman's collar. When Posey mentioned the bird brooch, the room went dead silent. Eleanor finally understood who the woman in the drawing was. I read the diary Eleanor brought me. It was written by a frightened 19-year-old girl. Eleanor told me I had read enough. The burden of carrying a terrible secret alone had nearly crushed her. "Tomorrow," said Miss Marple, "I think I'm well enough for a short walk. We must have the courage to look the darkness straight in the eye."
"She's very quiet, keeps to herself, comes to church, helps with the flowers." Henrietta looked at her. "Jane, what is it?" "Nothing at all," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if you still have that book you borrowed from Mrs. Phelps, the one you mentioned last week." Henrietta stared at her. "The trollop? Yes, it's on the hall table. I've been meaning to return it for a month." "Tomorrow," said Miss Marple. "I think I'm well enough for a short walk, if you wouldn't mind coming with me." They went the next morning. The vicarage was at the far end of the village, past the post office and the church, set back behind a wall with a gate that needed painting. The Reverend Phelps was out, conducting a funeral in the next parish, his sister said, was opening the door. She would tell him Henrietta had called. Agnes Phelps was not yet 70. She was small, with the light, careful movements of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Grey cardigan, grey skirt, hair set in the way it had probably been set since 1955. She smiled at Henrietta with the warmth of someone who has learned to perform warmth convincingly, and at Miss Marple with polite inquiry. "My friend, Miss Marple," Henrietta said. "She's staying with me while she gets over this wretched cold." "Oh, the cold is quite going now," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "I'm nearly myself again. I hope we're not disturbing you, Mrs. Phelps. Henrietta has been meaning to return your trollop for weeks, and I insisted we must." Agnes Phelps said it was no trouble at all. Please come in. She would make tea. and the sitting room was tidy to the point of severity. Everything in it had a place and stayed there. No clutter, no abundance of small objects, no excess of anything. A room kept by someone to whom an object out of place would be a source of distress. Careful, Miss Marple thought. Agnes Phelps was very careful. She wore a brooch at her left collar. Small, gold, worked in the shape of a small bird. A wren, wings tucked, head tilted slightly, one eye just visible. Miss Marple looked at it once. Then she looked away at the window and asked a pleasant question about the garden. They stayed 25 minutes. Agnes Phelps was a good hostess, attentive, unremarkable, pouring tea with the steady hands of someone who has had a long time to become steady. She asked after Miss Marple's health, expressed sympathy about the cold. He said it was so difficult at this time of year. Towards the end, Henrietta mentioned the business with the stranger in the churchyard, which was impossible not to mention as it was the only thing in the village worth talking about. Agnes Phelps shook her head. So dreadful. A stranger in a village and something like that happening. One feels so sorry for his family. Apparently there's a brother, Henrietta said, in Exeter. Well, there was a brother. Something happened in Agnes Phelps's face. Not much. A small contraction around the eyes gone in an instant. Her hands wrapped around her teacup did not move. They found the body on the north side, she said, under the yew, I believe. That's right, said Henrietta. The east side floods terribly in autumn, Agnes Phelps said, or the ground on the north side is much more stable. She said the last word with perfect ordinaries. Took a sip of tea, looked at the window. Miss Marple looked at her own hands and said nothing. On the walk back to Larkspur House, Henrietta was quiet for 2 full minutes, which was unusual. Jane, she said at last. Yes, you were watching her. Was I? Miss Marple tucked her scarf more firmly. The morning was cold, the kind that sat in the chest. I was watching the garden mostly. Those late dahlias, I thought, very well kept. Jane, Miss Marple walked on a few steps. She asked which side of the churchyard, she said. When you mentioned the body, you hadn't said which side, but she asked about the north side. Henrietta stopped walking, because she knew, because she has known, for 9 years, exactly where the ground on the north side is different from the ground anywhere else. Miss Marple's voice was even, not cold, simply factual, the way hard things sometimes need to be stated. She checked, 2 days after Leonard Goss was found. She came to put flowers on the church altar, and she went to look at the ground under the north yew. Mrs. Hargreaves saw her and mentioned it to the vicar as an act of kindness, thinking she was upset about the discovery. She was checking that the ground had not been disturbed more than she intended. Henrietta stared at her. Jane, are you saying, I'm saying, said Miss Marple carefully, that I should like Dr. Haydock to arrange for Inspector Crewe to speak with me this afternoon. And I think it might be wise if someone were to ask the police whether the ground under that yew tree has been examined below the level of Leonard Goss. The lane was quiet. A rook crossed the sky above the church tower and landed on the yew without ceremony. The boy, Henrietta said. Her voice was different now. Robert? Yes, said Miss Marple. I'm afraid so.
The brooch. It was there, but she saw something else. A very good day to you all. We often hear people say of a neighbour, she's very quiet, keeps to herself.
When Henrietta and I visited Agnes, her home was tidy to the point of severity. Not a single object out of place. Agnes smiled at us, but it was a performed warmth. Over the decades, we gain a sort of sixth sense, don't we? I played the part of the chattering, harmless old invalid. It is one of the few distinct advantages of growing up.
And there it was, pinned to her collar, a small gold wren brooch, the exact detail little Posey had added to her drawing of the murder. Agnes poured our tea with hands that did not tremble. It takes a lifetime of terrifying discipline to be...
Henrietta, entirely innocent of my plan, mentioned the dead man in the churchyard. Sometimes the most effective way to catch a culprit. When her brother's name was mentioned, Agnes had a tiny spasm around her eye. Just for a fraction of a second.
I told Henrietta it was time to call Inspector Crewe. There is no joy in uncovering such a dreadful...
Eleanor brought the second drawing on a Sunday. She came without Posey this time, which told Miss Marple something about the state of things. She set the drawing on the table and stood back from it, the way you stand back from something you have been carrying and are glad to put down. It was on plain paper, pencil, done with the careful seriousness Posey brought to everything. The yew tree was better than the first. She had looked at it more closely, had or drawn it more times since. The grave mound was the same. The figure in the green coat was the same. And in the background, small but distinct, a woman. She was drawn the way children draw adults they've actually seen. Not idealized, not a generic shape, but specific in small ways that children notice without knowing why. The particular set of shoulders. The way a person holds their head. And at the left collar, a shape, roughly circular with small projections. Posey had drawn it as carefully as she drew anything. A bird, perhaps, or a pin in the shape of one. Posey drew this yesterday morning, Eleanor said. She said she'd remembered something she left out. She was very matter-of-fact about it. She said the woman had a bird pin and she'd forgotten to put it in the first time. Miss Marple looked at the drawing for a long moment. "Has she met Agnes Phelps?" she asked. "That you know of?" Eleanor frowned. "She comes to church, and she helps with the Harvest Festival. Posey was there this year. She helped carry things." She paused. "Why?" "Mrs. Phelps wears a brooch," said Miss Marple. "A wren, always at the left collar." Eleanor looked at the drawing. At the small, careful mark at the left collar of the woman in the background. She sat down. "I don't understand," she said. "How would Posey? She drew it from the diary. The figure was in the diary. She copied it. She's never..." Eleanor stopped. "She's never even spoken to Mrs. Phelps that I know of." "No," said Miss Marple, "but she's seen her. And the figure in the diary, whoever drew it from life. Children copy faithfully, Eleanor. They don't invent the small details. They record them." The sitting room was very quiet. The radiator had given up its machinery sound entirely, which on the whole was an improvement. "She was 19, Miss Marple said, in 1943, a housemaid at your father's farm. She had been stealing money from the household tin, the allowance set aside for the evacuees' keep. Helping herself a little at a time. Robert saw her. He was 9 years old and difficult and absolutely certain, in the way that 9-year-olds are certain, that what he'd seen was wrong." She paused. He told her he would tell. Eleanor's hands were still in her lap. She was frightened. She made a decision that frightened people sometimes make. Miss Marple looked at the drawing, and then she went on. People do go on. That is the difficult truth of it. She left your father's house, married, became Agnes Phelps, and arranged flowers in the church. 68 years old. She has lived in this village her whole life, more or less, and no one ever came near the truth. Until Leonard Goss found his way here. He came to her, Eleanor said, not to the police. He had been looking for 30 years. He knew his brother had been in Wexley Combe. He may have known more than that. The notebook will tell us eventually. He came to her first, I think, because he wanted to understand. He wasn't only angry. He had been waiting long enough that the anger had turned into something else. A need to know. Miss Marple set down her needles. She couldn't allow it. She had too much practice by then in the decision that frightened people make. "The same tree," Eleanor said. Her voice had gone very flat. "Yes, I think she did not plan it carefully, and she followed him to the churchyard in the evening. He had gone there, perhaps to see for himself, to look at the ground. She took a stone from the churchyard wall. She knew the tree. She knew the ground." Miss Marple's voice was even, steady, not cold, because this was not a cold thing. It was a dreadful thing, and evenness was not the same as coldness. And then she tidied it, as she has always tidied things, and came back to the vicarage and went on. Eleanor pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly, let them drop. "Posey," she said. "Does Posey doesn't understand what she's drawn. She found some pictures in a tin and copied them. She added a detail she remembered from church." Miss Marple looked at the drawing. "She drew the truth without knowing it was the truth. Or that is all. Will she have to know?" Miss Marple considered this seriously, which was the right way to consider it. Not for a long time, and perhaps not from you. These things have a way of becoming history, eventually. Something that happened before she was born, in a world she didn't live in. "My father," Eleanor said. "Did he? I don't think your father knew what had happened to Robert. I think he believed the boy had run away. It was an easier thing to believe, and he was a man who found easier beliefs convenient." She paused. "That is not the same as guilt. He was careless. It is a different failing." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Then the photograph, in Leonard Goss's pocket. Your father may have given it to someone in the course of his inquiries about the missing boy. A welfare officer, perhaps, trying to show who else lived in the house. Leonard Goss would have collected everything he could find, every scrap." She paused. "He had his brother's last address. He had 30 years of careful notes. He deserved better than what he found here." Eleanor looked at the drawing one last time. Then she turned it over, face down, and left it that way. Miss Marple picked up her needles. Outside, the garden was making its peace with November, which had arrived 3 days early and showed no remorse.
The second drawing. It reveals the truth.
Good day to you. Eleanor returned on a dreary Sunday, and this time she came alone. Posey's second drawing was much more detailed. She had looked closer. As we age, our physical eyesight may dim, but our mind's eye grows sharper. There, hiding in the shadows of the drawn yew tree, was the figure of a woman. It is a terrifying realization. Under the magnifying glass, the tiny dot on the woman's collar became clear. It was the shape of a bird, the gold wren brooch.
"I don't understand," she said. When Eleanor realized who the woman in the drawing was, she collapsed in shock.
Agnes lived right here among us for decades. She smiled, she poured tea, she went to church. Leonard Goss finally found her after 30 years. He went to her for answers, not vengeance. And Eleanor was terrified that little Posey would have to know the horror of what she drew. But I assured her time is a wonderful
Inspector Crewe came on Sunday afternoon. He sat in Henrietta's sitting room with his notebook and his careful policeman's face, and listened to Miss Marple talk for 25 minutes, without once looking sceptical, which she considered well trained of him. He asked 3 questions, one about the diary, one about the brooch, one about Agnes Phelps's precise knowledge of which side of the churchyard the body had been found on, before she'd been told. "You think the goss boy is there too," he said, "under the yew." "I think the ground will tell you," said Miss Marple. "It usually does, if you ask it properly." Crewe wrote something. Looked up. "Mrs. Phelps has lived in this village for 50 years. Yes, everyone knows her. Yes, the vicar is entirely innocent," Miss Marple said, "of everything except perhaps choosing not to look too hard at what his sister had become. But that is a grief for him, not a crime." Crewe nodded slowly. "The Hadlow woman. Eleanor. The photograph." "She panicked," said Miss Marple. "She saw her father's photograph in a dead man's pocket, and she took it before she thought. She has been afraid ever since that it makes her look guilty of something she did not do. It makes her look frightened, which is what she is." She looked at him steadily. "I trust that distinction will be made." "I'll need her to come in. Yes, she knows that. She'll come." Crewe looked at his notebook for a moment. Then he closed it. "You said the child's drawings, the Hadlow girl." "Posey? She copied pictures from the diary, from a tin in a back room." "Yes. So she's not—" He stopped, seeming to search for the word. "She's not anything except a child who found some papers she didn't understand," Miss Marple said. "She drew what she saw, accurately and faithfully, because she is that sort of child. She has been helpful without knowing she was being helpful." She paused. "She should be left entirely alone." Crewe nodded once. That seemed settled. He went to Agnes Phelps that same evening, with a constable and a warrant. What was said between them, Miss Marple did not hear directly.
I think I see it now. The inscription on the sundial in the garden. He must have hidden it there.
Good day to you all. On a gloomy Sunday afternoon, Inspector Crewe arrived at our door. When authority comes knocking, it can be quite... I spoke for 25 minutes, and Inspector Crewe listened without a single sceptical look. Agnes knew the ground on the north side of the yew tree was stable. A small slip of the tongue, but a monumental one.
The inspector realised the horrifying truth. The little boy and the man searching for him were buried under the exact same tree.
I had to ensure the inspector understood poor Eleanor's actions. She stole the photograph from the dead man because she panicked. The inspector asked about little Posey. I made it absolutely clear the child is to be left entirely alone. We must fiercely... The inspector nodded. It was settled. There is a deep satisfaction in reaching an understanding built on mutual respect. That very evening, Inspector Crewe headed to the vicarage with a warrant. The long shadows of the past had finally... I was not there to hear what was said when the inspector confronted Agnes. Some moments are too full of regret.
Henrietta heard it third hand, from the district nurse, who had been visiting old Mr. Farrow 2 doors from the vicarage, that Agnes Phelps had opened the door and seen the inspector, and stood for a moment looking at him, and then stepped back to let him in without a word. As if she had been waiting. As if, after 68 years of being careful, some part of her was tired of it. The ground under the North Yew was examined on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, the answer was what Miss Marple had expected. Robert Goss had been there since August 1943, 9 years old. A small, stubborn boy from Bermondsey, who had knocked over his milk 3 times in 1 week, and seen something he shouldn't have seen and said so, because he was 9 and certain, and that had been enough. What Miss Marple told Eleanor. She came to the post office on Tuesday. The post office in Wexley Combe occupied the front room of a terraced house on the main street, with a counter worn smooth at the edge, and a smell of paper and rubber bands that post offices have always had and probably always will. A bell rang when the door opened. Eleanor was behind the counter weighing something for Mrs. Pruitt, who took her parcel and looked at Miss Marple with barely concealed curiosity before leaving. Then it was just the two of them. "I thought you might come," Eleanor said. She didn't say it badly, more like someone who has been waiting and is relieved the wait is over. "May I sit?" Eleanor lifted the counter flap and led her through to the back, where there was a small room with a table, 2 chairs, a kettle on a shelf. Through the window, the garden. Posey was in it, crouched over something near the wall, a beetle, perhaps, or a stone that had interested her. Eleanor made tea without being asked, and they sat. "She confessed," Eleanor said. "Agnes Phelps." "Yes, I thought she would. Inspector Crewe told me this morning." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. "He said she talked for a long time. That she'd been carrying it." She stopped. "A long time," Miss Marple said. "Yes." Eleanor looked at the window, at Posey, who had abandoned the beetle or the stone and was now walking the length of the garden wall with her arms out, a-balancing. "She was 19, Eleanor said, not excusing it, just placing it somewhere." "Yes, and she just went on. People do," Miss Marple said. "It's the thing about people that is both admirable and terrible. They go on. They find a way to fold the worst thing they've done into themselves and carry it without anyone seeing the shape of it. Most of them carry it until they die, and no one ever knows." She paused. Agnes Phelps kept a diary. She wrote it all down. That was the thing she couldn't stop herself doing. It was the only place she ever told the truth. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She hid it at the farm, in the tin. When the farm was sold, yes. She couldn't destroy it, and she couldn't keep it where anyone might find it. So she put it somewhere and trusted to time and dust. Miss Marple looked at the window. At Posey, arms wide, walking the wall. She very nearly trusted correctly. "Posey," Eleanor said. "A rainy afternoon," Miss Marple said. "A child in a room full of boxes, and one tin without dust on the latch." Eleanor made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite the opposite. "My father," she said, "he really didn't know." "I believe not. He wrote the report that Robert had run away. He believed it because it was a simple explanation, and he was tired, and it was wartime, and there was a great deal happening that required more of his attention than one difficult homesick evacuee who had probably, in his assessment, simply gone." Miss Marple paused. He was wrong. He was incurious when he should have looked harder. But he was not a murderer, and he did not know his housemaid was one. Eleanor breathed out slowly, and the exhalation of something that had been held for days. "Leonard Goss deserved to know what happened to his brother," Miss Marple said. "He spent 30 years asking the question properly. It's a sorry thing that the answer cost him what it did." "I keep thinking about him," Eleanor said, "coming all this way, finally finding someone who knew." And then she stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is very sad." Outside, Posey had reached the end of the wall and jumped off, landing with both feet and looking pleased about the distance. "Will Posey have to know?" Eleanor asked. The same question as before, but different now. More settled. Asking it now for the last time. "Not for a long time," Miss Marple said. "She drew some pictures from a tin box. That's all she knows and all she needs to." She looked at the child in the garden. "Oh, she'll be 12 before it becomes village history, and 16 before she's curious enough to ask you about it properly. By then, you'll know what to say." Eleanor looked at her hands. "What do I say?" The truth, Miss Marple said, that a frightened girl made a terrible decision and kept it too long. That her brother spent his life trying to find him. That a child who was precise about things drew some pictures that helped. She paused. That justice took a long time, but arrived. These things can be said plainly when enough time has passed. Eleanor was quiet. Then she'll ask about the drawings. She'll be rather proud of them, I should think, said Miss Marple. Something shifted in Eleanor's face. The thing that had been pulled tight since the green-coated man was found under the yew. Not gone. These things don't go. But less taut. Bearable. They drank their tea. The kettle ticked on the shelf. In the garden, Posey walked the wall again, arms out, certain of her balance. Children see what we bury, Miss Marple said. That is why we must be careful what we hide near them. Eleanor looked at her daughter through the glass for a long moment. I'll be more careful, she said. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think you will be. She finished her tea and set the cup down. And outside the rain that had been threatening all morning finally arrived. And Posey came running in from the garden with her arms full of something, calling for her mother. And Eleanor went to the door to meet her. Miss Marple sat alone for a moment in the small room behind the post office. She thought about Agnes Phelps, who had been 19 and made the first terrible decision, and then all the ones that followed. She thought about Robert Goss, 9 years old and certain about what was right. She thought about Leonard, 30 years of careful notes in a small notebook, a return ticket in his pocket, a photograph of a girl at a farm gate. She thought about Posey, 7½, crouching over a tin on a rainy afternoon with the faithfulness of a child who looks at things properly. Then she gathered her bag and her scarf and let herself out. And the bell above the post office door rang once as she went, and the rain came down steadily on the street of Wexley Combe. End.
The truth I seek lies here, buried with the secrets of the past.
A very good day to you, my friends, as we reach our final chapter. Agnes Phelps opened her door to find Inspector Crewe waiting. On a dreary Monday morning, the police dug into the earth beneath the ancient yew tree.
They found poor little Robert, only 9 years old. It breaks the heart. May his soul finally rest in peace.
I went to see Eleanor at the post office. The transformation was remarkable. The sheer terror that had gripped her was gone.
Eleanor's father had written the report that Robert simply ran away.
It was easier for him to believe a lie than to look closer at an I cannot help but think of Leonard Goss. 30 years he spent searching for his brother. Such devotion is a... Justice took a very long time in Wexley Combe, but it finally arrived. In the autumn of our lives, we sometimes... And so, the rain washes the streets of our...